Howdy gamers, today we're going to go over the most basic bare bones introduction Simplex support services. So here I have just a basic mission set up, just showing everything that you can do, the most basic things you can do, how to set things up, and kind of giving you an introduction. So we're going to start over here at the artillery, and basically all the support modules can be split into one of two basic groups. First, you have your physical supports shown here. They're things that are actually going to spawn in the world, and it matters where you place them on the map because where you place them on the map is where it's actually going to take place in the mission, and they will be there forever, and that's where they'll respawn. Over here, we have our virtual supports. So these spawn when you request it. So actually, when you're in the mission and request it, it will spawn and do the thing that you told it to do, and then despawn after it's finished. But for now, we're going to start with these actual physical supports. So here we have artillery, and I've set up a variety of different things. So here we have, we got mortars, artillery pieces, and then we have these more abstract cruise missile and this, the Mark 45 hammer. But then I also included this Mark 21 Centurion, and you might, oh, so that must work as artillery. But no, this actually does not work. And I wanted to include this because there are things that you might think would work, but not every turret or vehicle that you might include will work. So I kind of and just included this to show it off. But let's go over the actual module itself and start explaining that. So here we have the properties that you can edit in the editor. This might look complicated at first, but all of the modules share similar things, so it gets easy once you mess around with a couple of minutes. We're just going to run through it real quick. So first you have the call sign. This is what's going to be actually displayed in the mission, and you'll see that a bit later, but you can name it anything you want. So here we'll just name order. Respawn time, this is pretty self-explanatory. If the thing dies, let's say, blows up, this is how long it'll run. Relocation, this is something new with the dev version of Simplex support services. Basically, in the mission, you can tell something to relocate, which means wherever it spawned on the map. So you see how it's here in the actual editor. If you were in the mission and you could tell it to relocate, it would then go somewhere else, and that's where it would spawn for the future. At least that's my understanding of how. So you can allow players to do this or don't do this. Relocation delay, again, pretty self-explanatory. It's like respawn delay, but only with the location. And the speed, so this is for this is probably a bad example with the mortar, but vehicles, how fast they're going to drive when actually relocating. So cooldown, again, this is kind of self-explanatory. Minimum time between requests. Once you request something in the mission, it'll do it, and as soon as it finishes doing it, this is how long you have to wait before you can call it in again. So round cooldown, this is specific to artillery. This is the additional time increased per round fired. So you just have this 60-second cooldown by default, but for each round shot, let's say someone requests 10 rounds, that's an additional 100 seconds added to this cooldown period. So you can set this how you want. This is all depending on what kind of mission you want and how you want your players to actually be able to use this. It's completely up to you. So ammunition, this is something that was I found pretty tedious when I first started Simplex support services, but it's gotten way easier with the new version. If you leave this completely empty, it'll just use whatever the vehicle has default. If you want to use specific weapons, you're going to have to figure out what those item class names are. The best way I know how to do this is going through the config, but if you're using vanilla vehicles, then there are wiki pages you can use. It all depends on the vehicle you use and weapons and some modded weapons, and it's something you kind of just have to play around with. I'm not going to go too much into detail because I usually just use defaults for the most part. Now, projectile velocity. This is not something I've used that much, but basically you're just overwriting the default velocity for the round that's being fired. But again, I haven't really used this, so it's something you should probably just test with your mission and the vehicles and that you're using. We have maximum coordination distance. So if you have multiple of the same artillery pieces, they can coordinate together and shoot their rounds all at once. And then here you can actually select what you actually wanted to coordinate with. So you have support entities, non-support entities, and any batteries. So support entities, like other module supports, non-support entities, so stuff that isn't actually like has the module and is considered a support. And then you can do other nearby batteries, which also require the support. So here we have something pretty neat. We can actually choose the icon. By default, it'll just select the icon by itself, depending on what type of thing you've actually placed. But for modded vehicles and stuff, maybe it might not show up correctly, or if you just want to set it yourself, you can always do that. Here we have initial execution delay. You're going to see a lot of this type of stuff with the other modules too. It's basically how long it'll wait before actually executing the support that the player has requested. Here you have a minimum time, so let's just 5, then a maximum time of, let's just say, 60. And so this is in seconds. So if someone requests a mortar strike, no matter what, it'll wait 5 seconds before actually executing that mortar strike. But it has a chance to go all the way up to 60 seconds. Most likely it'll be somewhere in between. So keep that in mind. It's a bit random. You just have a minimum and maximum. And then same thing here with the minimum fire delay. Pretty simple, but instead of waiting after the support has been called, like this execution delay, this is in between each round firing. So let's say a player requests 10 rounds, then it's going to wait a minimum of however many seconds or a maximum of how many seconds between those 2 rounds. So let's just say you have a minimum of 0 and a maximum of 2 seconds. But that's also something that's in the actual mission that I'll show you later that players can request themselves. So here we have types. Converge, parallel, box, creeping. These are just different types of artillery ways that kind of it targets, and it's better just to show in the mission, so just keep these in mind. It's something you should play around with yourself and then decide yourself, what do my players, should they be able to use, or maybe they want to use. It's better just to test it yourself and see what they actually do, but we'll go over it once we get. So loops, this is also something that I kind of have to show you in the mission, but it's essentially gonna repeat the fire mission over and over, and this is how many times it can do that, or how many times the player can request it to do. So this is the delay that should pass between loop, kind of self-explanatory. So this is the amount of tasks. So again, in the mission, you'll see you can set, it's a lot more advanced than the old Simplex support services because you can use, or correction, you can set up like essentially a bunch of different waypoints like you would in the editor. So that's the best way to explain it, and you'll see that a bit later. Max rounds, self-explanatory, the amount of rounds that this unit can fire. This should be noted that this is the amount of rounds, I believe, per request and not the total, but I could be wrong about that. So execution delay and firing delay slider. So this is different than this here. These numbers up here is what you're setting in the editor. So this is what you as the mission maker are saying happens every single time someone requests something in the mission. But this is a slider that the player gets to use inside of their little GUI in the mission. And so you can set the limits that you want. So vehicle initiate, this is a very powerful tool that you'll see in all the support modules. I can show you a bit of this when we go over my example mission. It's very complicated. Just think, essentially, the best way to think of this is you can execute any script you want using this initiate. If you don't know how to script, then you'll probably won't use this much, especially if you just want the bare bones. But if you want some more complex stuff, then this is very important. Remote control, pretty self-explanatory. You can remote control the gunner in the mission. This is very helpful for like helicopters or UAVs, but you can also use it for these artillery pieces if you do. The side, pretty self-explanatory, what side it'll actually spawn in. So you might even be using a blue 4 unit, but you can tell it to spawn in as op 4. So you have remote access. So basically, you can use this from the in-game GUI. Access items, the item that the player needs on them to actually use the support, and access items logic. So basically, if there's multiple items in this, then you can select it so they either need all of the items or only one. All of these are not really needed if you just want something very simple, but if you're a unit, for example, that's setting up supports and you only want certain people to have supports, like for example, a JTAC only should have access to the CAS, you can limit down certain items, and there is a restrict access module, but I'm not exactly sure how that works, simply because I don't use it that much. But you'll see this for every single module, and it's a very powerful tool. But again, it depends on what you actually want. So here we have some more scripting tools that can be used to limit access. So essentially, you can use code and scripts to limit access. Again, I haven't really used this. I believe you could use it so it could maybe detect like classes, stuff like that, using a script and then deny or allow access. But I'm not exactly sure. I don't use it. It's something that you'll have to test around with. So that's artillery. And I know that was a lot, but you'll see with these other modules that they share a lot in common, and it gets much easier as you go. So we're just going to quickly move on to the other physical transports. These are all transportation, technically, based on the modules. Plane transportation. Now, this is the VTOL. I don't have any mods enabled, so but just think like RHS C-130 and I have it on here in the editor. but I won't actually be able to show you it in this at least, simply because it requires a runway. Now, how it works, I'll just briefly explain it in case anyone will use it. You'll spawn it in at an airport. Once it receives a request, it'll teleport to the nearest runway and then just take off. It can be a little bit glitchy with certain planes and runways. It's just something you have to test on your own. I've had problems with it in the past, but most of those problems were also with the old Simplex support service, so use it as you will. Here we pretty much have the same thing, but this is a VTOL mode. So basically it just takes off and lands using hovering. Here we have land transports. So anything that's wheeled or tracked, you put onto there. And then we have helicopters, any rotary wing. There is also the access for transport boats. Again, pretty self-explanatory, the same thing. So we'll just quickly go over the transport modules. And again, you're going to see something that looks very similar. Less options than before, but it's pretty similar and self-explanatory. Again, call sign, you just have your display name, anything you want to name it. If you leave it blank, it'll just use the vehicle's name by default. Respawn timer again, relocation delay, you have all that. But see, now what's different is these task types. Now you can see I have some of these unchecked. Now, what's actually really interesting about this new version of Simplex support services is these new task types, which you'll see in the mission, and I'll show you how to use them. But essentially, you can limit what your players can and can't do with these certain vehicles. So for this land transport, you see I've connected it to a tank. Now you'll see under here that there is task types for search and destroy and fire at target. So you have to kind of think out of the box with these supports. You see it's called transport land vehicle, but you don't have to use it as a transport. And you'll see this with the helicopter in a second. It does not have to be a stereotypical transport truck like I have here set up, although you can perfectly use it for that. You can set it up in here and you can tell it just to move, path, follow, hold, unload. You could even have it set seek and destroy a fire target, but it won't do anything, so I've unchecked those. So I kind of just included these two examples as just ideas to get you started. I mean, again, you can use any type of vehicle you want. All of these cars, use any of them. So just kind of something to think out of the box. But right here, we just have a stereotypical transport vehicle. You'll hop in, you'll tell it to go somewhere, it'll unload you, and that's that. For the rest of this, it's all the same things that you've seen before on the artillery. Max task, max timeout, the vehicle initiate, the side that it spawns at, the remote access items, and the logic. All pretty self-explanatory, pretty simple. Here we have the helicopters, which are basically the same thing. You can see you have more task types here. Move, follow, hold, land signal, hover, fast rope, helocast, loiter, sling, load, pickup, drop off, unload, pair drop, seek and destroy, strafe. Now, these are very interesting. They're definitely a lot more unique than the old Simplex support service. I'll go over more of these task types when we actually get in the mission. But again, you can just limit what your players will actually be able to do with these supports. And everything else is pretty much the same, except for maybe these altitude limits. Again, pretty self-explanatory. You can set the minimum and maximum altitudes that your players can select in the UI, and then everything else same. Now, I've added this attack helicopter for you guys to think outside of the box again, just like the tank. You can have a transport helicopter that doesn't actually transport anyone. So you see here, I've unchecked all the stuff that does the transporting stuff, but left seek and destroy and strafe. So now this helicopter will actually spawn in the mission when you request, let's say you request a strafe down here at the bottom, this strafe option. Let's say the player requests that, it'll take off, it'll shoot its gun at the strafe, and then you could tell it to just go back to base and land. So it's way more practical than the old Simplex support service. And then again, everything else down here. So that was a lot. That was just our physical transports. Now, before we move on to the virtual transports, I'm just going to show you what this actually all looks like in the mission for these physical transports, and then we'll come back to the editor. So here we are in the mission, and you can see all of our stuff is still here. Now, the default thing, you can press Control Y, and it'll bring up this little menu here. Now, at the top, you have the service type. So artillery, cast, legit transport, all the different types. So let's just stick with our artillery for now. And then you go right below that, you have entity. And these are all the different vehicles or class names basically put in. So you have here, this is the example that I gave you of that missile launcher on the end there. It does not work. And I showed you this just because not every vehicle type is going to work. You're going to see down here, it has no ammunition. But if you go to this M4 Scorcher, for example, you can see this one does actually work and it has all this ammo. Now, these are pretty much all the same. The only differences being its firing range capabilities, so this is the cruise missile. This is the minimum range. So if it's inside of this, it cannot fire, but if it's outside, then it can fire. So it's probably easier to see. It has quite a large minimum range. And down here, again, you have all your ammunitions. But let's look back at the top and you can see status. It says idle, and there's a little option here to abort. Down here you have fire mission and relocation, and even the transport helicopters have another option that'll say confirmations. So here we have our strike plan, all the different task types that you can do, and the fact that you can do them up. You can see here it shows you the grid that you're shooting at, the type that you're doing, the actual task type, the shell that you're shooting or using, the number that you're firing. This is the execution delay, and this is the time in between. You can see here that there's some buttons to add tasks, remove tasks, clear all, and some plan options. This is the loop and coordination that I was talking about in the editor. So there's no other scorchers in the area, so it can't do animation. But you can also do loop count. For now, let's just add another task. So you can click this button and click add task. And now you'll see that there's two options. If you click in between, these are two different missions. You can also, so now you see these are two different missions. And if I edit this one to, let's say, use 9 cluster, and this one is still using the shells. So you can probably already see that this is quite useful if you want multiple different ammo types fired, or as you'll see for the transport, multiple points for the vehicle. So down here, this is where it gets kind of complicated. Now you have these different types, and all the data that it shows on here is all based on the actual vehicle itself. So for example, you see this mortar has a maximum range, minimum range, and that's based on the mortar itself. So that's something to keep in mind when you're selecting supports for your mission. Now let's just go down right here to the transport at the top. You click your service, and then let's go down to transport. So here we have our Blackfoot transport tank, the plane transport, the ghost hawk, and the blackfish. So you see here, all of these except for the plane transport are using the vehicle name. You can see with the plane transport, that's the custom name that I put in the module. So with this Blackfoot, you can basically use it like how you would in the editor. So you can control click, and that creates new task types: return to base, move, follow, hold, land, hover, loiter, seek. But you'll see here that these are not the same task types that I have available for, let's say, the Ghost Hawk. Go down here, and you see it has different task types like these sling loads. And that's again what I showed you in editor. This is what your player is going to see, and the options that they're going to have. Let's just go back to Blackfoot, and you can see we can set it to move, 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 move. But then let's just say there's a target here. We could then tell it strafe. And wow, a bunch more options just showed up. Would you look at that? So this is probably where it gets complicated, and it takes a little bit of getting used to, but down here we have our primary weapon and secondary weapon. Let's focus on that first, because this is the most important part. And this will be the same for the virtual modules in the future. Pay attention to this, and then once we get to that, it'll be exactly the same thing, and you'll already know. So here we can select the actual gun that the helicopter will be using. And you can see here it says gunner. It's actually telling you which vehicle seat is actually going to be fired weapons. And this is important if you plan on remote controlling the vehicles themselves. But anyways, so we'll select the 20mm. Then down here you see this little pound sign or hashtag, whatever you want to call it. And this is the amount of rounds that are being fired. So it's pretty self-explanatory with rockets. With these miniguns and with like the A10, it's a little bit more confusing just because I think you have to think individual bullets. So one 20mm shell isn't going to do a lot, but you could, for example, type 40, and that's how many rounds it'll fire. And then here we have seconds, I believe seconds in between each bullet is being fired. Okay, so you've got your weapon set. Now, you could theoretically just confirm this and it'll do exactly what it says. But there's a lot more options that you can do. So right above this, you'll see target. And there's a lot of different options you can choose. So map position is just exactly where the grid position that you selected. Laser designator. So here you have default or match. Basically, default is, in my understanding, default, it just finds the laser designator, shooting its laser, locks onto that, and tracks it using the weaponry. So even if you move the laser designator, it'll still track. Whereas if you use match, I believe it'll just find the laser, target it, lock that position where the laser was shooting, and then if the laser moves after it already locks, it will no longer track it. It will just shoot where that laser. That's to my knowledge. I've had a lot of glitches with the laser where it just sometimes doesn't even lock the laser or track it. So it's something you'll have to test around with, and hopefully it gets updated in the future. We can go down to smoke IR flare. This is pretty self-explanatory. You can choose a smoke grenade and the color. Again, this is also kind of glitchy. You kind of have to take into account the fact that smoke only lasts for usually about 40 seconds. It's something you kind of just have to play around with. I've had trouble using it. I wouldn't really recommend using it, but if you can get it to work, then go for it. Again, IR and Flare, same thing. Now, this is the interesting part down here is any enemy infantry. If you select any enemy, it will search by default 500 meters in a radius 500 meters from that map position that you've selected. So this strafe marker here on the map, it'll search in a radius of 500 meters, however large that is, but you can change that. So maybe you only want it to search a radius of 150 meters. You can do that. I have had this be a little bit glitchy. I'm not sure it actually detects the closest enemy to the map marker, meaning if there's an enemy right on your map marker, but you have a radius set of 500, I think it'll still engage, like it'll just engage any enemy that it detects. Not exactly sure how that works. But it's something you should keep in mind, and you might get some weird results based on that. But again, like I've said a bunch of times already, test it for yourself, see what happens. It's a very strong feature and unique. And then we can continue on adding more waypoints if you wanted. And then you can either go down to here and click return base, or let's just say have this move marker base, or what's faster is just to click this little icon, house icon left, and that'll do that for you. So now you see we set this whole thing up and it will do this whole waypoints all on its own. However it wants, you can add timeouts in between each waypoint. So when it gets here, it'll wait 100 seconds before going to that one. You can set speed limits. It's all, but you can also go up to here and remove individual tasks or add them using this plus and minus up here at the top. So I just clicked minus and that removed that specific waypoint. I can click plus and add a new waypoint in between. You can also click the trash can just to remove everything. As a note, your task will be saved if you close the menu, and they will be saved even after all the tasks have been complete. So the same thing is true for all these other. Again, the only thing that difference types that it can do, and something you'll have to keep in mind with the land transport, they actually have to drive through the map. Something that I've done in the past, allowing players to sling load pickup and drop off. So if they really wanted to, they could sling load pick up transport vehicle or support vehicle, take it with them, drop it off. So all these other transports are exactly the same. You see here is the confirmations tab I was talking about earlier. This confirmation tab is only really used with a specific task or task types. So for example, land signal, loader pickup, or sling load pickup drop off. And so essentially, which each of these tasks, I'll just give you an example of land signal. It's searching for a specific grenade. So it'll arrive to this location, loiter, wait for you to throw a smoke grenade, for example. And then once you throw that smoke grenade, you have to go into this confirmation tab and confirm the color of smoke that. Now, I should mention, this is something that people kind of forget is when you're using this land, you need to set a timeout. Now, the reason you need to do that is I'll show you an example of, let's say move, then I want you to land here. But then once you land and pick us up, I want you to move. Perfect. So now we switch this to land. Now it's going to move. It's going to land there and then move again. But you see there's a fatal flaw here is it's going to land. As soon as it lands, it's just going to take off again. So what you need to do is set a timeout. Now this is just going to wait in seconds. And as soon as it waits 40 seconds, it'll take off and move. You could just not have any move markers afterwards and it'll land and just stay there. If you don't have any movers, then you don't need a timeout. So that's just something to keep in mind. But you got a lot of tools here. So I've shown you all that. Let's go back into the editor and I will show you the virtual module. So here we are back in the editor and we've just got some very basic virtual set up here. We have our logistics over left and our close air support on the. So I've just got a couple set up. For cast loiter, loiter is exactly what you think. It just loiters around the place you set. This is typically, I would typically only use this for UAVs, or if you're doing like gunships like Fish, that's all I would really use it for. Although you technically can use it for helicopters. As far as I know, you can't use it for planes. Planes just do not work. It gives you an error. I don't know if this is intentional. This is just from my experience. But you see here, I'll open it up, and here I have a helicopter, and in this other one I have UAV, and you could do it. I'll just quickly run through this. Again, like a lot of things you've already seen before. See the call sign, call down. Now this is new, the virtual run. This is new, spawn distance, the spawn delay, and you've seen this, the outcome. I think you've probably seen this radius limit, but again, so the maximum set for loiter around, the duration, the actual time loitering, repositioning the pylons and weapons. I've shown that, but we'll go into more depth here. Infinite ammo, pretty self-explanatory. You got some different tasks that I've seen before. Now, minimum friendly range, this is new. We'll go over that. So we'll just quickly go through this. So virtual runway, again, kind of self-explanatory. You select a specific position in the editor. The easiest way to do that is to right click, click log position to keyboard. So you can see your position here. This is your X, Y, E. So you could plug that in if you want to. This is useful if you want to kind of virtually, for your vehicle to virtually spawn. Now keep in mind, I don't actually know if it can spawn on the ground. I would just recommend the Z value to be positive. Now, if you're not using a virtual runway, then spawn distance is what's important. For this example, I've just set 1,000 just so it's easy. But you can set this, basically this is how far away the actual vehicle will from where the person is requesting. So wherever the person game is requesting a map, it'll spawn X amount of meters away from that position. The direction depends on where it's set in the actual. Again, we have spawn delay in this, altitude limits in this, radius limits. We're all good there. Weapon. So here we are at the pylons and weapons. Now this is where it gets pretty easy for typical weapons that you want to use for your cast, especially just default weapons. But there's two ways you can input stuff into the cast module. First, you could do everything manually, meaning you log the class of aircraft, put it into the module manually, find pylons or weapons that you want to use, and then put those manually into the module. But there is a much easier way to do it. First, simply go to the editor and grab whatever vehicle you want to use. For the example, I'm just going to use a wipeout. Simply spawn it, right click, hit connect to, and then sync it to your module. Once you've synced it, you can then just delete the vehicle as it is not needed to be spawned in the mission, as it's a virtual module and it'll spawn the vehicle itself. Now, if you go look into the module, it was previously empty, and now all the weapon classes and the class name will be filled out for you. Now, keep in mind, it uses whatever pylons are actually on the vehicle at that time that you sync it. So if you want specific weapons, then I would recommend adding the pylons to what you want on the actual vehicle before you sync it. So jumping back into the properties of the module, I just want to show you this real quick, the minimum friendly range. In the module, or correction, in the mission, I'll show you a bit later, you'll actually be able to see that there's a danger close option. And so what that does is in the module here, you set a minimum friendly range where the aircraft AI will not engage the target no matter what if friendlies are within this range. So by default, it's 50, but you could set this 150, for example. And so if a friendly is within 150 meters of the target you're trying to kill, it will not engage. But there is an option inside of the GUI that the player can actually select saying danger close, and it will override this range, and it will engage the enemy no matter what, even if friendly are within this range. So I honestly recommend setting this a bit higher than 50, and then the players themselves can choose if they want. And then everything else down here you've seen before, self-explanatory. So in the examples I've given, loiter helo, this will be a helicopter that'll spawn, and a loiter UAV, again, same thing, it'll spawn, it'll loiter, and you have remote control here, which allow the player to actually get into the gunner slot. And then we have our 2 cast strafes. So this is also something good, is you can use helicopters or planes for these casts, and probably more than that. It'll be a one-time strafe. So essentially the vehicle will come in, so for example, this wipeout come in, shoot its weapons, and then fly off and despawn, and then you'll have to wait. Now we're moving to logistics. Logistics is probably the hardest thing to get into, actually use, just because it requires a little bit of scripting and a little bit of knowledge to do. And here I have just the three most basic things, but sling load and airdrop is just what you're going to want to stick with on a simple level. So here we'll go into airdrop. And this is just a basic airdrop, and it's pretty self-explanatory up here. A lot of this overlaps with what things we've talked about before. So aircraft class, this is just the vehicle that's going to spawn and fly overhead, and essentially what you're going to be role-playing is what's going to be dropping. The call sign, again, name it whatever you want. Cooldown, again, same thing. Item cooldown, this is exactly like the artillery. For each item that is spawned, there's an additional time period added to the cooldown. Altitude, this is the height of the aircraft class that you find up here. That's how high it's going to be. Virtual runway, this is again just like the other things where you can set it to spawn somewhere specific on the map. And something to note here is that if you set this altitude at 500, but you spawn it at 50, you need to keep in mind that it's gonna rapidly climb up to this altitude. So keep that in mind for where it spawns. Spawn distance, again, this is just like S. The one thing to note is that as far as I'm aware, there's no way to determine which direction this spawns in, unlike the cast. The cast, you can tell which way the plane should come in from, but for these logistics planes, there's no way to tell it which way to come in. Spawn delay, again, just the minimum and maximum initial request and how long it takes. Parachute altitude for your AI AI and objects. This is just the altitude at which the object or AI will deploy their parachute after getting capacity is just the amount of vehicles that you can call in at one time, assuming that each vehicle costs 1 point to spawn in, but we'll talk about that a little bit later. Now, down here is where it gets complicated. List function is actually what's going to be spawned in. Now, in this list function, I just have the default code from the wiki, which is linked in the description, and you should just use that as a base. This is the example code that it gives, and you can see vehicles here at the top. These will just be listed in the request menu. These under here will have a custom title. Then these again will have a custom title like this image shows down. I would recommend copying this from the wiki and then editing it to your desires. If you're someone who just wants to simply and quickly set this up, then I recommend using this reference area. So I've set a couple different vehicles inside of this reference area. You can change the side and also the item initiate. This will be run for every single item here. Whereas if you use the coding version, then you can set specific vehicles to have functions. So starting at the top, we have behavior, you have monitor, and initiate. So essentially you can define this area. And I believe how it works is if mid-mission someone drives a vehicle in here, it'll then be added. Now we have categories. This is what I was talking about earlier, having your custom categories, and you can see wiki. Again, you're getting a lot less control with this reference area. So I believe it'll all just go into one category. So here we have infantry referencing. This is just deciding how to handle infantry that's in the actual area. So by default, it's just disabled and no infantry will be added to the support menu. But if you want infantry to be able to be spawned inside of your reference area, then you have to reference them either as individual units or whole groups of units. So that's kind of up to you. Again, less control than the scripting, but you got what you got. This is a filter you can use if you don't want specific objects in this area to actually be added. Load evaluation, again, this is what I was talking about earlier. And that's it for these virtual supports. Just one more thing I want to show, just because it's kind of neat. You can set up an object to be able to access remote supports. So what you do in the modules, you select this terminal option, and then simply sync it to any object. I've selected here the computer, and I've then synced it to a cast loiter, which is a UAV. Now, what I've done just for the example is I've limited it to item GPS, but my character does not have a GPS. Or you can just check this little box disabling remote access, which means nobody will be able to use it unless they go to the module. It just depends on how you want to set it up and if you want some people to still have access to it remotely or not at all. We're just going to leave that enabled for now for the example. And essentially, you'll just walk up to this terminal and you'll get access to it, which I'll show you right now. And I'll show you all these other virtual supports. So here we are in the mission, and you'll see that nothing has spawned over there because of that function that we clicked called initiate. And first, I'll show you this terminal real quick. So scroll wheel, and now you can see terminal UAV. I click on it, and it gives me access to port menu. If I exit out and then hit Control Y, and then go under here to cast and search for terminal UAV. So you see these players won't have access to it unless they actually go up to this. For the other cast modules, it's all pretty self-explanatory. These are all virtual again, so they're gonna spawn in when I actually request this support. And you can see here, this is a very, very nice little menu here, and you can see this is spinning. Why is it spinning? Because of the ingress and egress azimuth. By default, it just selects auto, or you can click this and you can do a specific actual bearing, or you can just do northeast, east, southeast. So you can actually tell it to come in. Let's just say come in from the north and then exit to the east. You could keep it auto, and if it autos, it'll just go opposite direction. Above that, you see altitude and firing range. This is how high it flies. So maybe you want it to come in low, maybe you want it to come in high. Depends on the type of weapons you're using. Firing range, basically the same thing. This is how far away the vehicle will be when it actually uses the weapons. Down here, again, we have targets. So just like what I showed previously, those helicopters. And then down here, we have, again, the search radius and the danger close. So here we have linear spread, and you can see on the map with these virtual supports, it actually shows you the how far it'll actually be going. Now here, again, just like before, we have the weapons you can select, the amount of weapons you want to be fired, and the interval in between. I'll just show you the loiter UAV because it's easy. You can see the loiter radius here. You can change that radius how you want. You can change the altitude how you want. You can change the direction it's loitering, the speed it's loitering, and the direction. Now, by default, it doesn't have a target. And this is because you don't want it to loiter above you and just shoot. Unless you do want that. And if you do want that, then select what you want. Again, same thing. You have your spread and you have your weapon down here. Down here, you see turret selection. We only have the gunner option available because the vehicle type. But if you're using like a Blackfish, for example, you have multiple gunners that have access to different weapons. So here we have basic airdrop and basic sling load. These are using the scripts that I showed you. They're using both the same thing. The only difference is the airdrop. It'll fly overhead. And so what you have to do is you have to click on the thing you want, double click it, and it'll go down here to the requested item. You can see how many slots it takes up and how many slots your vehicle has. And then down here, you can select landing signals. So pop a smoke once it lands, for example, and AI handling. So if there's any AI, like this missile specialist, for example, he'll either join your group or create his own stand. And we'll go ahead and click confirm. While that's coming in, let's go over to the basic sling load. I will show you. It's the same exact thing, but this time it uses a helicopter. And depending on the settings inside, it'll either spawn one helicopter or by default it spawns multiple helicopters. So if you had multiple vehicles, each one would use a separate helicopter. And we'll call that in. You can hear the plane, and boom, there the plane dropped that one vehicle. It's kind of far away, that's my mistake. You have the helicopter coming in. You see there's multiple helicopters because I requested multiple different vehicles. You can see here, they've gone ahead and landed. They've dropped off our vehicles. But you'll notice this one is sticking around because that one also has infantry. And the infantry is going to be dropped manually by the helicopter. And you'll see that in a second. Here we go. They're going to fast load out the bottom. And there they go. Now, one last thing. See, this is the sling load we created by using a referenced area. So here we have the category 1 that we named and all the items that were spawned inside editor. So there we go. That's the most basic setup. I covered pretty much everything, and it's something you'll just have to use, test out, and experiment for yourself. So thank you for watching. I hope this was helpful, and I'll see you next time.